Imagine you are sitting in your bedroom, and suddenly a large rock flies through the air and shatters your window. If we want to figure out why this happened, we have to look backward. The rock itself broke the glass, but a person standing outside actually threw it. Both the rock and the thrower are the reasons the event occurred. In history, we call these things causes. Now, if we look forward from the exact moment the glass breaks, we see a mess on the floor and a very frustrated homeowner. These reactions are the consequences, or the direct results of the window breaking. Human history operates exactly like this. Events never happen randomly. They are always triggered by prior actions, and they always create new realities. You can think of history as a massive, interconnected chain reaction. It looks a lot like a complex setup of falling dominoes, where one piece striking another sends energy branching out in dozens of directions. When we study the past, we look for two different types of triggers. The immediate, final actions that happen just days or weeks before an event are called short-term causes. Think of this as the finger physically flicking the very first domino. But we also have long-term causes. These are the deep background conditions that existed for years or even decades. They are the careful, heavy construction that made the event possible in the first place. To truly understand any historical event, you have to identify both the deep setup of the dominoes and the final flick that brought them down. Let's apply this to a real scenario. If we want to understand the Second World War, we need to discover the massive forces that caused it to begin. We can trace the setup back decades. This photograph shows leaders at the end of the First World War in 1919, signing the Treaty of Versailles. The terms of this treaty left Germany in deep economic ruin and built up intense anger among its citizens over 20 years. That resentment was a massive, long-term cause for the conflict that followed. By 1939, Adolf Hitler was leading Germany through a series of military campaigns. His aggressive expansion into Poland was the immediate short-term cause, the final flick of the finger that tipped the world into war. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, distinct actions were setting up a different chain reaction. The sudden, violent attack on Pearl Harbor acted as a massive cause in its own right in the Pacific. The direct consequence of that attack was the United States officially entering the war. This pulled the American military into the fight, turning regional disputes in Europe and Asia into a global conflict. As you study these chains, you'll notice that they never truly end. The consequence of one event simply becomes the cause for the next. For example, when the Second World War ended in 1945, a direct result was a tense, decades-long rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War. That rivalry then transformed into a long-term cause. It created political pressure that led to smaller wars in other countries, like the Vietnam War, as both superpowers tried to spread their influence. That exact same Cold War tension was also the long-term cause driving the space race. The pressure to outpace the Soviets spurred President Kennedy to issue his 1961 challenge to put a human on the moon. The historical consequence of that intense technological race was Neil Armstrong becoming the first human to step onto the lunar surface in 1969. When you track the path of those falling dominoes, you find that the end of a global war in 1945 directly stacked the pieces that propelled a human to the moon 24 years later. You might think the story of the 1969 moon landing ended with a flag planted in the dirt, but planting that flag was only the beginning of a new chain reaction. Consider the lunar rocks brought back by the astronauts. By comparing these to our own soil, scientists discovered they were made of the same materials. This provided the first real evidence that the moon was actually a piece of the Earth that had been blasted into space by a massive collision billions of years ago. There was also a massive technological consequence. To navigate to the moon, the space agency had to invent highly advanced, tiny circuitry. The tools they developed led directly to the creation of the modern computer chip. The very device you are using to watch this video right now is a direct, long-term consequence of the Apollo 11 mission. So how does this help you when you sit down to write an essay for history class? You can use a simple 3-step approach. First, identify your exact event. Second, find the long and short-term causes, meaning figure out what knocked it over. Third, track the consequences by observing what it hit on the way down. But remember, just because something happened before an event doesn't mean it caused it. You must be able to prove a direct connection between the two pieces for the link to be real. Once you start looking for causes and consequences, you will realize that history isn't just in books. Every choice you make today is setting up the dominoes for tomorrow.